Hi boys and girls, and welcome back to another edition of Snack Time with a Dollop of Read Aloud. Today, if you couldn't see from the bottom of that screen, today is a very special day. Today we're going to start reading our new book. We just finished Number of the Stars, which was emotional and just a beautiful book. And I know a lot of you loved it. In fact, some of you even gave it 10 stars out of 5, which I totally agree with. Today, we're going to start with another classic, and Mrs. Willis has to tell you a secret. As a child, Mrs. Willis, when I was your age, maybe even into middle school, there weren't really any books that I loved and that really got me into reading. I didn't get lost in reading like we just did in Number of the Stars. It wasn't until I was actually much older and I was a college student studying to become a teacher that I discovered Harry Potter through my children's literature class that I took in college at Chestnut Hill. Anyways, long story short, this series, Harry Potter, opened my eyes to a whole new appreciation for reading. And from here, I read the whole series. I've read it multiple times because of how much I love it. I've listened to it on Audibles. I even started reading another book that was another series that was kind of similar to this called Charlie Bone. And it's literally been nonstop reading ever since. So sometimes it just takes the right book to hook you in. For me, this was the right book that hooked me in. I love the Chronicles of Narnia, but again, I didn't have an appreciation for it the way that I do now. And it wasn't until I read it again as a teacher or a soon-to-be teacher that I saw it through a different set of eyes. So, from one reluctant reader to however many, when I was a kid, this book opened doors for me that never were open before. So, I'm hoping that through all these read aloud sessions that we've been doing, maybe some doors have been opened for you. I know you all loved Number of the Stars, and I hope that you love Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone almost as much, if not more. Okay? Here we go. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, with permission granted by Scholastic Publishing for me to be able to share this amazing book with you. All right, here we go. Dun, dun, dun. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning it over garden fences. So she was like a nosy neighbor, spying on her neighbors. The Dursleys had a son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. Their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. So they have these cute little pictures, so I'll share them whenever they pop up in the book. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't even have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived on the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked up or picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into the high chair. None of them seemed to notice a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a full-blown tantrum and throwing cereal at the walls. "That little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4 Privet Drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the sign, the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen, and then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat, and it stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, couldn't be reading. It must just be looking at the sign. Cats can't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get today. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in his usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people milling about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you see on young people. Outrageous. He supposed this must be some new stupid fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly to each other. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be the answer. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in Grunning's parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley sat with his back to the wall in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls whooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed at owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, except for in the nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important phone calls, and he shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the street to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He had forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were disappearing excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. In his way back, he pushed past them, clutching a large donut in a bag. That he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and almost finished dialing his home phone number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, "No, I'm just being silly." Potter was such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Potters. And who didn't have a son named Harry? It's very common. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure that his nephew's name was Harry. He had never even seen the boy after all. It might have even been Harvey or Harold or Henry. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She already had gotten so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he had had a sister like that, he'd get upset too. And all those people in cloaks, no. He found it harder and harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted at the tiny old man as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. Now, a cloak is a really long, it's like a cape with sleeves. He didn't even seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in the squeakiest of voices that made another passerby stare, "Oh, don't be sorry, my dear, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating. This is a happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around his wide middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood, rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He had also thought that the stranger had called him a muggle. Whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he did not approve of imagination. Imagination was a gigantic waste of time. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and this did not improve his mood, was that tabby cat he had seen in the morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure of it. It was the same one. It had the same markings around his eyes. "Shoo!" Mr. Dursley shouted loudly. The cat didn't move. It gave him a stern look. Was this a normal cat? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him about dinner, all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley said a new word, "won't." Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. "And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls must be behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls of England have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern." The newscaster allowed himself a grin. "Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? We would like to know." "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only owls that have been acting oddly today," the reporter said. "Viewers as far as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain that I promised yesterday, they've been having a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been collecting bonfire night early, or celebrating bonfire night early." So bonfire night, just so you know, is kind of like 4th of July here with fireworks and stuff like that. "It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise you will have a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat. "Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister at all. "No," she replied sharply. "Why?" Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, there was a lot of funny people talking in town today. So, Mrs. Dursley snapped. Well, I thought maybe it had something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her that he had heard the name Potter. He decided he did not dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, "Their son, he'd be Dursley's age, correct?" "I suppose so," Mrs. Dursley said stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard?" "That's right. That's it, right?" "No, it's Harry. A nasty common name, isn't it?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, quite common. I agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could this all have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he couldn't bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mr. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mrs. Dursley lay awake, turning it over and over in his mind. His last comforting thoughts before he fell asleep was that evening, if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him or Mrs. Dursley. Mr. Potter knew very well, or the Potters knew very well, that he and Petunia thought of them, what they thought of them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. He was very wrong. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinking on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching, and it appeared so suddenly and silently that you had thought he had just swooped to the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive before. He was tall and thin and very old, judging by the silver of his beard and his hair, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least once or twice. His name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where nothing from his name to his boots had just arrived on a street where everything from his name to his boots were unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open and held it into the air and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he flicked the putter-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were the two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out the window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Mrs. Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the marking of the cat had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald green one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I have never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed dozens of feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everybody's celebrating, all right. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room. "I heard it. Flock of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that was Daedalus Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for the past 7 years. Or the past 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideway glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about all of us." "I suppose he really is gone, right, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so, Minerva. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop, which is a candy?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're a kind of Muggle sweet that I am rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think that there was a need for lemon drops. "As I say, even you-know-who is gone. Even if you know who is gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years, I've been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed to not notice. "It all gets so confusing when people keep saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated and half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you-know-who was afraid of." "You flatter me," Dumbledore said calmly. "Voldemort has powers I will never nor shall I ever want to possess. Only because you're too, well, noble for them," Professor McGonagall added. "It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying, about why he's disappeared, about how they finally stopped him." It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop from his pocket and did not answer. "What they're saying," she pressed on, "is that last night Voldemort turned into Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are, well, that they're dead." Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. "Lily and James, I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus." Dumbledore reached out and patted her shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled slightly, but she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill Potter's son. Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that wee boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry, Voldemort's powers somehow broke. And that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. Is it true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a wee boy? It's just astounding. Of all the things to stop him. But how in heaven's name did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore, and truthfully, we may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a large handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very old watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, Professor McGonagall answered. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people who live here? Cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I've seen him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter can't come and live here. It's the best thing for him, Dumbledore said firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him. And when he's older, I've written him a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about him, about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk or even talk, famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all of that before he's ready to handle it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth and changed her mind. She swallowed and then said, yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here? Dumbledore. She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it's wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He tends to... What was that? She said. A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and a beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots looked like baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last. And where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir. And the giant climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep just as we were flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just as visible, was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead, they could see a curious shaped cut. The shape of a lightning bolt. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore, "and he will have that scar forever." "Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars come in handy. I have one above my left knee that is a perfect map of London Underground." "Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arm and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir?" asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake the Muggles!" "Sorry!" sobbed Hagrid, taking a large spotted handkerchief out of his pocket and burying his face into it. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with these awful Muggles." Yes, it's very sad. But get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm. As Dumbledore stepped over a low garden wall and walked to the front door, he laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blanket, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling lights that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here any longer. We may as well go back and join in the celebrations." "Yes," Hagrid said in a muffled voice. "I'll be taking Sirius's bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked down the street. On the corner, he stopped and looked back, and took out his silver putter-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back to their street lamps, so the Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out the tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry Potter," he mumbled. He turned on his heel, and with a swoosh of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him as he slept on. Not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He didn't know that that very moment people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, to the boy that lived." All right, boys and girls, that was a rather long first chapter, but it was a great first chapter. It's how Harry got from Godric's Hollow, where he lived with his parents that were wizards and a witch, to Privet Drive. And this is where his story begins. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you possibly at Class Share today at 11, and we will discuss whatever you did this weekend as well as how you enjoyed the story so far. This is the first chapter, and we will meet again tomorrow for another edition of Snack Time with a Dollop of Read Aloud. All right, miss you, love you, stay safe.